Welcome, dear friends, to a tale of unexpected love and redemption that proves family can be found in the most surprising places. Enjoy the story. The crackling fire in the opulent living room of Conrad Blackwell's Manhattan penthouse did little to warm the chill between the two occupants. Conrad, a silver-haired titan of industry in his mid-50s, swirled a glass of 30-year-old scotch, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the woman across from him. Vanessa Reeves, barely pushing 28, was a vision in a slinky red dress that left little to the imagination. She toyed with a strand of her honey-blonde hair, a coy smile playing on her perfectly painted lips. "Conrad, darling," she purred, "you're awfully quiet tonight. Is something wrong?" Conrad forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just thinking, Vanessa. About us. About the future." Vanessa's eyes lit up. "Oh? And what do you see in our future, Mr. Blackwell?" As Conrad opened his mouth to respond, a flood of memories washed over him. His ex-wife, Eleanor, tearfully packing her bags. His daughter, Isabel, screaming that she hated him before slamming the door for the last time. The bitter taste of betrayal that had become all too familiar. "I see. Complications," he said finally, taking a long sip of his drink. Vanessa pouted, rising from her seat to slink over to Conrad. She perched on the arm of his chair, running a manicured finger along his jawline. Now, Conrad. Don't tell me you're getting cold feet. We're so good together, aren't we?" Conrad caught her hand, his grip perhaps a bit tighter than necessary. "Are we, Vanessa? Sometimes I wonder if you see me, or just my bank account." Vanessa's eyes widened in mock hurt. "How can you say that? I love you, Conrad. You know that." But as Conrad looked into her eyes, all he saw was his own reflection and the shadow of doubt that had been his constant companion for far too long. 6 months earlier, Conrad Blackwell's world had been turned upside down by the arrival of Vanessa Reeves. She'd breezed into Blackwell Industries' HR department like a breath of fresh air, all bright smiles and innovative ideas. At the quarterly review meeting, Vanessa had stood out among the sea of gray suits. Her presentation on streamlining the company's hiring process had been nothing short of brilliant. "And that, ladies and gentlemen," Vanessa had concluded with a dazzling smile, "is how we can cut our recruitment costs by 30% while improving the quality of our hires." The boardroom had erupted in applause, and Conrad found himself clapping along, intrigued by this young upstart who dared to shake things up. Later that evening, at the company's annual gala, Conrad had spotted Vanessa by the bar, looking uncomfortable in a modest black dress that seemed at odds with her vibrant personality. "Not enjoying the party, Miss Reeves?" he'd asked, sidling up beside her. Vanessa had jumped slightly, nearly spilling her champagne. "Oh, Mr. Blackwell, well, to be honest, these events aren't really my scene. I feel a bit out of place." Conrad had chuckled, charmed by her candor. "Would you believe me if I said I felt the same way? Even after all these years, I'd rather be in my office crunching numbers than schmoozing with shareholders." Vanessa's eyes had lit up with genuine warmth. "Really? I thought I was the only one who felt that way. Everyone else seems to live for these parties." "Tell you what," Conrad had said, making a split-second decision. "Why don't we slip out of here and grab a real drink? I know a little jazz club around the corner that's much more my speed." Vanessa had hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "You know what? That sounds perfect." That night had marked the beginning of a whirlwind romance. Conrad found himself swept up in Vanessa's energy and zest for life. She made him feel young again, reigniting a passion he thought had long since burned out. Their relationship had progressed rapidly, from stolen moments in the office to weekend getaways in the Hamptons. Vanessa had practically moved into Conrad's penthouse, her youthful exuberance breathing new life into the once sterile space. But even as Conrad fell deeper under Vanessa's spell, a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered warnings. He'd been burned before, trusting too easily, loving too deeply. Could he really open his heart again? Or was he setting himself up for another devastating fall? Conrad sat in his study. The lights dimmed low. A small velvet box opened before him. Inside nestled a ring that had been in the Blackwell family for generations. a stunning Art Deco piece with a central diamond flanked by sapphires. His grandmother had worn it, then his mother, and finally Eleanor. Conrad's throat tightened at the memory of slipping it onto Eleanor's finger, both of them so young, so full of hope for the future. "Mr. Blackwell?" The soft voice of his housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, broke through his reverie. "Is everything all right, sir?" Conrad snapped the ring box shut. "Yes, Mrs. Abernathy, just reminiscing." The older woman's eyes fell on the box, a knowing look crossing her face. "Ah, I see. Well, if you don't mind an old woman's advice, sir, sometimes the past is best left in the past. Perhaps a fresh start would be more appropriate?" Conrad nodded slowly. "You may be right, Mrs. Abernathy. You usually are." After she left, Conrad returned his gaze to the ring box. With a heavy sigh, he opened his desk drawer and placed it inside, locking it away. He reached for his phone instead. "James, it's Conrad Blackwell. I need you to open up the store for me tomorrow morning. I'm in the market for an engagement ring." As he hung up, Conrad felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. Was he really ready to take this step with Vanessa? Or was he letting his loneliness cloud his judgment? He thought of Vanessa's laugh, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams for the future. She was everything he should want: young, beautiful, ambitious. So why did he feel this gnawing doubt in the pit of his stomach? Conrad shook his head, trying to dispel his misgivings. He was being paranoid, letting the ghosts of his past haunt his present. Vanessa loved him. She'd proven that time and time again. It was time to let go of his fears and embrace the future. With newfound resolve, Conrad began to plan. He'd make the proposal perfect, a night Vanessa would never forget. And maybe, just maybe, he could finally silence the doubts that had plagued him for so long. The next morning, Conrad emerged from James & Sons Fine Jewelers, a small box tucked securely in his pocket. The ring he'd chosen was exquisite, a cushion-cut diamond set in platinum, modern yet timeless. It had cost a small fortune, but Conrad knew Vanessa would love it. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, feeling lighter than he had in years, a small voice piped up beside him. "Excuse me, mister, can you spare some change?" Conrad looked down to see a young girl, no more than 7 or 8, gazing up at him with startlingly blue eyes. Her clothes were worn and dirty, her blonde hair tangled and unkempt. But there was an intelligence in her gaze that caught Conrad off guard. "Where are your parents, young lady?" Conrad asked, glancing around for any sign of an adult. The girl shrugged. "Don't have any. It's just me." Conrad frowned, his heart twisting unexpectedly. Something about this child stirred memories of Isabel at that age. The same determined set to her jaw, the same spark of defiance in her eyes. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Madeline," she replied. "But everyone calls me Maddie." Conrad made a split-second decision. "Well, Maddie, how about we get you something to eat? There's a cafe just down the street." Maddie's eyes widened. "Really? You mean it?" As they walked to the cafe, Conrad couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter was about to change everything. The cafe was bustling with the late-morning crowd, but Conrad managed to snag a quiet booth in the corner. Maddie slid in across from him, her eyes darting around the cozy interior with barely concealed wonder. "Order anything you like," Conrad said, handing her a menu. Maddie bit her lip, hesitating. "Anything?" A few minutes later, Maddie was digging into a stack of chocolate chip pancakes, syrup dripping down her chin. Conrad watched her, a plan slowly forming in his mind. "Maddie," he said carefully, "what would you say if I told you I might be able to help you? Give you a place to stay for a while?" Maddie paused mid-bite, suspicion clouding her features. "What's the catch?" Conrad chuckled. Despite her young age, this girl was clearly street smart. "No catch, well, I have a girlfriend, you see, and I'm thinking of asking her to marry me. But I need to be sure she loves me for the right reasons." Maddie's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Conrad leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "I'm what you might call wealthy, Maddie, and sometimes people are more interested in my money than in me. I need to know if Vanessa, that's my girlfriend, truly cares about me." Understanding dawned in Maddie's eyes. "So you want me to pretend to be, what, your long-lost kid or something?" My granddaughter, actually, Conrad corrected. Just for a week or two. If Vanessa reacts well, accepts you, then I'll know she's the real deal. Maddie considered this for a long moment, absently twirling a strand of her matted hair. And what happens to me after? You just dump me back on the street? Conrad felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't thought that far ahead. No, of course not. I'll make sure you're taken care of. Maybe find you a good foster family or… I don't want another foster family, Maddie cut in, her voice hard. They always send me back. Conrad nodded slowly. All right, then we'll figure something else out. I promise, Maddie, I won't abandon you. Do we have a deal? Maddie stuck out her small hand, her face serious. Deal, but I want it in writing. As Conrad shook her hand, fighting back a smile at her precociousness, he couldn't help but wonder what he was getting himself into. But something about this scrappy little girl had touched a part of his heart he thought long dead. For better or worse, Maddie was about to become a part of his life. Conrad's mansion was a flurry of activity as he prepared for Vanessa's arrival. He'd spent the past 2 days getting Maddie settled in, buying her new clothes, and coaching her on their backstory. The girl was a quick study, soaking up details about the Blackwell family history like a sponge. Now, freshly bathed and dressed in a pretty blue sundress, Maddie looked every inch the part of a well-bred young lady. But the mischievous glint in her eye reminded Conrad that she was still very much a street-smart kid playing a role. Remember, Conrad said, straightening Maddie's collar, you're my long-lost granddaughter. Your mother never told me about you. You've been living with a foster family, but they recently passed away. Maddie nodded solemnly. I know. We've been over this a million times. Don't worry, I got this. The sound of the front door opening made them both freeze. Vanessa's voice echoed through the foyer. Conrad? Darling, are you home? Showtime, Maddie whispered with a wink. Conrad led Maddie into the living room just as Vanessa entered. Her eyes widened at the sight of the child, confusion and something darker flitting across her face. Conrad, what's going on? Who is this? Conrad put on his best surprised but delighted expression. Vanessa, my dear, the most extraordinary thing has happened. This is Madeline, my granddaughter. Vanessa's perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat. Your granddaughter? But how? I thought Isabel. It seems Isabel had a child she never told me about, Conrad explained, his arm around Maddie's shoulders. Madeline's foster family recently passed away, and the authorities tracked me down as her only living relative. Vanessa's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. I see. And you're certain she's really your granddaughter? Maddie stepped forward, her blue eyes wide and innocent. It's nice to meet you, Miss Reeves. Grandpa Conrad has told me so much about you. Vanessa's smile was tight as she bent down to Maddie's level. Has he now? How lovely. Conrad, darling, could I speak with you privately for a moment? As Conrad followed Vanessa into his study, he caught a glimpse of Maddie's knowing smirk. The test had begun, and already Vanessa was failing spectacularly. Once the study door was closed, Vanessa rounded on Conrad, her eyes flashing. What the hell is going on, Conrad? You can't seriously believe this. This urchin is your granddaughter. Conrad feigned surprise at her vehemence. Vanessa, I'm shocked. Madeline is a sweet child who's been through a terrible ordeal, and she's family. Vanessa let out a humorless laugh. Oh, please, this is obviously some kind of scam. She probably saw your picture in the paper and cooked up this whole story to get her hands on your money. That's a pretty cynical view, don't you think? Conrad said quietly. It's realistic, Vanessa snapped. Look, I know you miss Isabel, but you can't just replace her with some random street kid. What about your reputation? What will people say? As Vanessa continued her tirade, Conrad felt a cold clarity settle over him. This was the real Vanessa, calculating, image-obsessed, and utterly lacking in compassion. How had he been so blind? I think, Conrad said, cutting her off mid-sentence, that you should go home and cool off. We'll discuss this more tomorrow. Vanessa's eyes widened in disbelief. You're choosing her over me? Conrad, be reasonable. Good night, Vanessa, Conrad said firmly, opening the study door. As he watched Vanessa storm out, Conrad felt a mixture of sadness and relief. The woman he thought he loved had never really existed. But somehow, in trying to test Vanessa's love, he'd stumbled upon something far more valuable, a chance at redemption, and perhaps even a family. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Conrad canceled all his meetings, delegating work to his VP so he could focus on Maddie. They went shopping for more clothes, visited museums, and spent hours in the park feeding ducks and eating ice cream. To Conrad's surprise, he found himself genuinely enjoying Maddie's company. She was whip-smart and funny, with a maturity beyond her years that sometimes broke his heart. He wondered about the hardships she must have faced to become so self-reliant at such a young age. One afternoon, as they strolled through Central Park, Maddie's small hand slipped into his. Conrad felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since Isabel was young. "Hey, Conrad," Maddie said, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" Conrad squeezed her hand gently. "Of course, Maddie. You can ask me anything." "Why," she began, then paused, chewing her lip. "Why are you being so nice to me? I mean, I know we had a deal and all, but you didn't have to do all this stuff." Conrad felt a lump form in his throat. He stopped walking and knelt down to Maddie's level, looking into her bright blue eyes. "Maddie, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Yes, we made a deal, but these past few days, they've meant more to me than you could possibly know. You're not just some random child to me anymore. You're—" He trailed off, suddenly overwhelmed by emotion. Maddie tilted her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "I'm what?" Conrad took a deep breath. "Your family, Maddie, and I want you to stay. Not just for a week or two, but, well, for as long as you want to." Maddie's eyes widened, a mix of hope and disbelief shining in them. "You mean it? You really want me to stay?" "More than anything," Conrad said firmly. Maddie threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. As Conrad held her, he realized that somewhere along the line, this little girl had stolen his heart. The plan to test Vanessa seemed trivial now compared to the unexpected gift he'd been given. A second chance at family. As they continued their walk, Conrad couldn't help but notice how much Maddie reminded him of Isabel at that age. The way she skipped ahead, her blonde hair bouncing in the sunlight, brought back bittersweet memories of days long past. It wasn't until they were heading home, the sun setting behind the city skyline, that Conrad noticed something glinting around Maddie's neck. "Maddie," he said, his voice suddenly hoarse. "That necklace you're wearing, where did you get it?" Maddie's hand flew to the delicate gold cross hanging from a thin chain. "Oh, this. I've always had it. My mom gave it to me when I was really little. It's the only thing I have from her." Conrad's heart began to race. He recognized that necklace. He'd given a matching set, the cross and a ring, to Isabel on her 16th birthday. Could it be possible? Before he could question Maddie further, a sleek black car screeched to a halt beside them. The passenger window rolled down, revealing Vanessa's furious face. "Conrad!" she snapped. "We need to talk. Now!" Conrad instinctively pulled Maddie closer to him. "Vanessa, this isn't a good time. We can talk tomorrow at the office." Vanessa's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Oh no, we're going to talk right now. You've been ignoring my calls for days, gallivanting around town with this child. What about us? What about our plans?" Maddie looked up at Conrad, her face worried. "Is she mad because of me?" Before Conrad could respond, Vanessa let out a harsh laugh. "Oh, sweetie, I'm not mad. I'm furious. Do you have any idea who I am? What I've given up to be with Conrad?" Conrad felt a chill run down his spine at the venom in Vanessa's voice. This wasn't the woman he thought he knew. This was someone capable of anything. "Vanessa," he said quietly, "I think you should go home. We'll discuss this later, when you've calmed down." For a moment, Vanessa's face contorted with rage. Then, just as quickly, her expression smoothed into an eerie calm. "Fine," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "We'll talk later. Have a lovely evening with your granddaughter." As the car sped away, Conrad couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation was far from over. He looked down at Maddie, who was watching the retreating car with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Come on," he said gently. Let's go home. The next day dawned bright and clear, a perfect New York summer morning. Conrad decided to take Maddie to his favorite diner for breakfast, hoping to lift her spirits after the unsettling encounter with Vanessa. As they walked down the bustling sidewalk, Maddie chattering excitedly about the stuffed animal she'd won at the park the day before, Conrad felt a sense of contentment he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since losing Isabel, he felt like he had a purpose beyond just accumulating wealth. They were waiting at a crosswalk, Maddie bouncing on her toes as she watched the countdown on the pedestrian signal, when Conrad's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, frowning at the unknown number. "Hello?" he answered, half distracted by Maddie's impatient tugging on his sleeve as the light changed. "Mr. Blackwell?" a gruff voice responded. "This is Detective Ramirez from the NYPD. We need to speak with you regarding an incident from last night." Conrad's blood ran cold. What kind of incident? As the detective began to explain, Conrad's attention was pulled away by a commotion on the street. He looked up just in time to see a car careening towards them, way too fast for the busy intersection. Time seemed to slow down. Conrad saw Maddie, already halfway across the street, oblivious to the danger. He saw the driver's face. To his horror, it was Vanessa, her eyes wild and unfocused. Without thinking, Conrad lunged forward, his phone clattering to the ground. He reached for Maddie, desperate to pull her to safety, but he was too late. The sound of screeching tires and screaming pedestrians filled the air as Vanessa's car slammed into Maddie, sending the little girl flying. Conrad's anguished cry was drowned out by the chaos around them. The next few minutes were a blur. Conrad cradled Maddie's small, broken body in his arms, heedless of the blood soaking into his expensive suit. Sirens wailed in the distance as a crowd gathered, some trying to help, others just gawking at the scene. Vanessa stumbled out of her car, her face pale and shocked. "Conrad!" she slurred, her breath reeking of alcohol. I didn't mean to." Conrad couldn't even look at her. His entire world had narrowed to the unconscious child in his arms. As the paramedics arrived and gently pried Maddie away from him, Conrad noticed something glinting on the pavement. Maddie's necklace, the delicate gold chain snapped by the impact. He picked it up with trembling hands, and in that moment, looking at the familiar cross he'd given his daughter so many years ago, the terrible truth hit him like a physical blow. Maddie wasn't just some random child he'd grown fond of. She was his flesh and blood. His granddaughter. Isabel's daughter. As he climbed into the ambulance, clutching Maddie's small hand, Conrad's mind raced. How had he not seen it before? The resemblance to Isabel, the necklace, the inexplicable connection he'd felt from the moment they met, it all made sense now, and he'd almost lost her, all because of his foolish game with Vanessa. "Please," he whispered, more a prayer than anything else, "please let her be okay. I can't lose her too." The ambulance doors slammed shut and they sped off towards the hospital, leaving behind a scene of chaos and a story that would soon explode across every tabloid in the city. The hospital waiting room was a special kind of hell. Conrad paced restlessly, his once immaculate suit rumpled and stained, his face haggard with worry. Every time the door swung open, he'd freeze, hoping for news about Maddie's condition. He'd been questioned by the police, given a statement about what he'd seen. Vanessa had been arrested at the scene, her blood alcohol level well over the legal limit. The detective who'd called him earlier, Ramirez, had taken one look at Conrad's devastated face and decided to postpone their discussion about whatever incident he'd called about. As the hours crawled by, Conrad's mind raced with questions. If Maddie was truly his granddaughter, where was Isabel? Why hadn't she told him about her daughter? And how had Maddie ended up on the streets? A gruff voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "Mr. Blackwell?" Conrad turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man in a rumpled suit. Detective Ramirez, he presumed. "How's the little girl?" Ramirez asked, his voice gentler than Conrad had expected. "Still in surgery," Conrad replied, his voice hoarse. "They haven't told me anything." Ramirez nodded sympathetically. "I'm sorry to bother you at a time like this, but there are some things we need to discuss. Things that might be relevant to your Granddaughter's situation. Conrad's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Ramirez sighed heavily. Mr. Blackwell, the call I made to you this morning, it was about your daughter, Isabel. I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but her body was found last night in a motel room in Queens. Apparent drug overdose. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Conrad staggered back, collapsing into a nearby chair. Isabel dead? But how? When? We're still investigating, but based on the evidence, she's been deceased for at least 48 hours, Ramirez explained. We found some documents in her room, birth certificates, medical records. That's how we identified her, and learned about her daughter. Conrad's head was spinning. Isabel had been in the city this whole time, and now she was gone, just when he'd discovered the existence of his granddaughter? The thing is, Mr. Blackwell, Ramirez continued, his voice low, we have reason to believe your daughter's death wasn't accidental. There were inconsistencies at the scene, and given the incident with your granddaughter today. You think they're connected? Conrad finished, a cold dread settling in his stomach. Ramirez nodded grimly. We can't rule it out, especially given Miss Reeves' involvement in today's accident. Before Conrad could respond, a doctor in blood-spattered scrubs emerged from the OR. Mr. Blackwell, your granddaughter is out of surgery. She's stable, but... Conrad was on his feet in an instant. But what? What aren't you telling me? The doctor's face was grave. The impact caused significant head trauma. We won't know the full extent of the damage until she wakes up, but you should prepare yourself for the possibility that she may never fully recover. Conrad felt his knees buckle. Detective Ramirez caught him, helping him back into the chair. Can I see her? Conrad managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor nodded. She's being moved to the pediatric ICU. A nurse will come get you when she's settled. As the doctor left, Ramirez put a hand on Conrad's shoulder. Mr. Blackwell, I know this is a lot to process, but I need to ask, is there anyone who might have wanted to harm your daughter or granddaughter? Anyone who stood to gain from their removal? Conrad's mind flashed to Vanessa's face, contorted with rage as she sped towards Maddie, to the calculation he'd seen in her eyes when he first introduced the child as his granddaughter. Yes, he said slowly, a cold fury building inside him. Yes, I think there is. As Conrad began to recount everything that had happened over the past week, he made a silent vow. He'd failed Isabel, and he'd very nearly failed Maddie. But not anymore. Whatever it took, he'd protect his granddaughter and bring to justice anyone who had harmed his family, no matter the cost. 3 months later, Conrad stood in the doorway of Maddie's hospital room, watching as the little girl painstakingly wrote her name on a piece of paper. Her blonde hair, now growing back after being shaved for her surgeries, stuck up in adorable tufts around the scar that ran along her temple. Very good, Maddie, the occupational therapist praised. Your handwriting is getting better every day. Maddie beamed, her blue eyes bright with pride. When she caught sight of Conrad, her smile widened. Grandpa, look what I did! Conrad's heart swelled at the word Grandpa. It had taken weeks for Maddie to speak after waking from her coma, and even longer for her to remember who he was. But every small victory, a word, a smile, a moment of recognition, felt like a miracle. That's wonderful, sweetheart, Conrad said, crossing the room to kiss the top of her head. You'll be writing novels before we know it. As the therapist packed up her things, Conrad settled into the chair beside Maddie's bed. How are you feeling today, Mads? Maddie's face scrunched up in concentration, a new habit she'd developed as she worked to process her thoughts. Good, she said finally. Head doesn't hurt so much. I'm glad to hear that, Conrad said softly. Do you remember what the doctor said yesterday? About going home soon? Maddie nodded slowly. Home with you? That's right, Conrad confirmed. To our new house by the beach. Would you like that? After the accident, Conrad had made the decision to step back from his company, handing over the reins to his VP. He'd purchased a sprawling beachfront property in the Hamptons, far from the chaos and painful memories of the city. Maddie's eyes lit up. Can we build sandcastles? Conrad laughed, a sound that had become more frequent in recent weeks. "We can build all the sandcastles you want, Princess." As Maddie chattered excitedly about her plans for their new home, Conrad's mind drifted to all that had happened since that fateful day. The investigation into Isabel's death and Maddie's accident had uncovered a web of deceit that still made Conrad's blood boil. Vanessa, it turned out, had known about Maddie all along. She'd been blackmailing Isabel, threatening to reveal Maddie's existence to Conrad unless Isabel stayed away. When Isabel had finally worked up the courage to come clean, Vanessa had panicked. The accidental overdose had been anything but, and the hit and run was a desperate attempt to eliminate the last piece of evidence linking her to the crime. Vanessa was now awaiting trial, facing charges of murder, attempted murder, and a host of other crimes. Conrad had made sure she had the best prosecutors money could buy on her case. But justice for Vanessa was cold comfort compared to the gift Conrad had been given, a second chance with Maddie. The road to her recovery had been long and grueling, with setbacks and frustrations aplenty. But every day, Conrad saw more of the bright, resilient little girl he'd first met emerging. "Grandpa?" Maddie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Will you tell me about my mom again?" Conrad smiled softly. This had become a nightly ritual, Maddie asking for stories about Isabel, piecing together the mother she couldn't remember. "Of course, sweetheart," he said, settling in more comfortably. "Your mom was the bravest, kindest person I've ever known. And you know what? You remind me of her more and more every day." As Conrad began to recount tales of Isabel's childhood, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The past few months had been the hardest of his life, but they'd also brought him the greatest joy he'd ever known. He didn't know what the future held for him and Maddie. Her recovery was far from complete, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead. But as he looked at his granddaughter's smiling face, Conrad knew one thing for certain: whatever came their way, they'd face it together, as a family. In the end, Conrad reflected, his plan to test Vanessa's love had backfired spectacularly. But in its failure, he had found something far more precious: the love of a child he never knew he had, and a chance at redemption for the mistakes of his past. As the sun began to set, painting the hospital room in warm hues of orange and pink, a nurse poked her head in. "Mr. Blackwell? There's a Detective Ramirez here to see you." Conrad nodded, giving Maddie's hand a gentle squeeze. "I'll be right back, sweetheart. Why don't you draw a picture of our new beach house while I'm gone?" In the hallway, Detective Ramirez stood waiting, his face as impassive as ever. "Mr. Blackwell," he greeted with a nod. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Conrad assured him. "What can I do for you, Detective?" Ramirez's expression softened slightly. "I wanted to let you know personally, the DA is moving forward with all charges against Miss Reeves. With the evidence we've gathered, plus her confession, it's looking like a slam dunk case." Conrad let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. That's good news. Thank you." "There's more," Ramirez continued. "We've also identified the man who helped Miss Reeves cover up your daughter's death. He's agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence." A wave of emotions washed over Conrad: relief, anger, grief. "I see. And Isabel, has a date been set for the funeral?" Ramirez finished gently. "Yes, sir. The medical examiner has released her body. It's set for next Tuesday, if that works for you and Maddie." Conrad nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, that should be fine. Thank you, Detective, for everything." As Ramirez turned to leave, he paused. "Mr. Blackwell, for what it's worth, I think you're doing right by that little girl in there. Not many men in your position would have stepped up like you have." With that, the detective walked away, leaving Conrad to ponder his words. He returned to Maddie's room, finding her bent over a colorful drawing of a house by the sea, her tongue poking out in concentration. "Look, Grandpa," she exclaimed, holding up the picture. "I drew our new home." Conrad's heart swelled as he examined the crayon masterpiece. "It's beautiful, Maddie. We'll have to frame it and hang it in the living room." As he sat back down beside her bed, Maddie's face grew serious. "Grandpa, Can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart, anything. Maddie fidgeted with her blanket. When we go to our new house, will you have to leave me sometimes? For work and stuff? Conrad felt a pang in his chest. Of course, she would worry about being left alone again. No, Maddie, he said firmly. I'm not going anywhere. My job now is to be here with you, always. Maddie's eyes widened. Really? But what about your big company? Conrad smiled, reaching out to smooth her unruly hair. I've decided to retire, Mads. I've worked hard for a long time, and now it's time for me to focus on what's really important. And that's you. Tears welled up in Maddie's eyes. You're not going to leave me? Ever? Never, Conrad promised, gathering her into a gentle hug. You're stuck with me, kiddo, for better or for worse. As Maddie's small arms wrapped around his neck, Conrad felt a sense of peace wash over him. For the first time in years, Conrad felt truly, unequivocally happy. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Isabel's funeral was a small, somber affair, attended only by Conrad, Maddie, and a handful of Isabel's old friends. Maddie, still fragile from her injuries, had clung to Conrad throughout the service, her face buried in his suit jacket. After the funeral, they made the move to their new beach house. The sprawling property, with its private stretch of sand and expansive views of the Atlantic, felt like a world away from the chaos of the past few months. Maddie's recovery continued, with good days and bad. There were triumphs, the first time she walked unaided along the beach, the day she read a full paragraph without stumbling. And there were setbacks, nightmares that left her screaming for a mother she couldn't remember, moments of frustration when her body or mind wouldn't cooperate. Through it all, Conrad remained steadfast. He learned to navigate the complex world of traumatic brain injury rehabilitation, attending every therapy session, researching new treatments, and advocating fiercely for Maddie's care. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Maddie turned to Conrad with a thoughtful expression. Grandpa, do you think my mom would be proud of me? Conrad felt his throat tighten with emotion. Oh, Maddie, he said softly, your mom would be so incredibly proud of you. You're the bravest, strongest person I know. Maddie smiled, leaning her head against Conrad's shoulder. I'm glad you found me, Grandpa, even if it was an accident. Conrad chuckled, wrapping an arm around her small shoulders. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Conrad reflected on the strange, twisting path that had led him here. He had lost so much, his daughter, his company, the life he had built for himself. But in that loss, he had gained something far more precious. He looked down at Maddie, her eyes heavy with sleep, and felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly took his breath away. This, he realized, was what he had been searching for all along. Not wealth or status or power, but the simple, profound joy of family. And that, he thought, was the greatest fortune of all.